let's get you the latest developments as far as the Russia-Ukraine crisis is concerned. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry today announced the end of Crimea military drills. The Russian Defense Ministry shared a video, in fact, of military equipment and forces leaving the region. Now, this move comes after Moscow said on Tuesday that some of its troops are returning to home bases, indicating cooling off tensions regarding the Ukraine issue. But the West, it seems, is unconvinced with claims made by Russia and has asked the world to be cautious. Well, those are the details here. Now, NATO nations are coming out expressing strong reservations on Russia's statements on the withdrawal of troops. NATO chief, in fact, has claimed that Russia seems to be building up its forces around Ukraine, despite Moscow announcing a pullback of more forces from the border. Moreover, the UK Defense Minister has advised caution over Russia's move and said that the evidence of withdrawal hasn't been seen. According to UK Defense Secretary's claims that they have seen continued build-up of things like field hospitals and strategic weapons systems, which is a sharp contrast to Russia's claims. In fact, NATO nations are now coming out and expressing these strong reservations.
We haven't seen is evidence of withdrawal that has been claimed by the Kremlin. In fact, we've seen continued build-up of things like field hospitals and strategic weapon systems such as Iskander missiles deployed. So I think the reality is, I said last week when I visited Moscow, is that we'll take Russia at its word, but we'll judge them on their actions. And, you know, if we're going to build up trust to try and de-escalate this incident, what we need to make sure is that we're not building up troops at the same time. And that is still what we see. And until we see a proper de-escalation, I think we should all be cautious about the direction of travel from the Kremlin.
Let's in fact go across to Maruf Raza, Strategic Affairs Editor of Times Network, who's joining us here on the broadcast. Thank you very much, Maruf, for joining us. Do you think it's too early to say that the crisis has been averted? Because clearly latest comments coming in from UK at this point shows that it doesn't seem like the West is convinced that there is in fact a pullback at this point.
See, Russia had built up a formidable force on the borders of Ukraine and in areas like Belarus, where these exercises were taking place. And you cannot pull back all those troops overnight. It takes very long to build them up. It takes a fairly long time to pull them back. So therefore, we have to wait and watch, firstly. Secondly, in military terms, this could be seen as what some people might call a feint, which means that they pretend to do something, but they are still focused on doing what has been assumed by intelligence agencies and governments in the West, which means that Russia is still building up for a major attack on Ukraine. If that be the case, when would Russia do it? My guess is anytime between the 20th of February till about 10th of March. One, because Mr. Putin would be back from the Winter Olympics in China. And two, until then, the snows are there and the snows permit these heavy mechanized and armored vehicles to move very quickly. After that, when the snow melts, the ground becomes slushy, movement is slow. Eventually, most of these operations are going to be defined by the territory that Russia can gain. The third aspect is that Russia has in place more than just troops on the ground. It has enormous capacity to inflict damage on Ukraine in particular, and also in European countries through air power, cyber power, and missile systems. So just moving out some tank units back to Russia may not be, I think, comfortable enough for the Western countries. But having said that, let me also reiterate the position that Russia has been harping on, that it never had the intention of invading Ukraine, though Mr. Putin, in his writings and statements, has repeatedly asserted the historical Russian binding with Ukraine. Remember, the Russian state was founded in Ukraine in the 9th century, pardon me. So therefore, there is a desire that to get Ukraine to make Russia and its history complete. The other aspect is that the Ukraine has served as a buffer for Russia against expansion of any forces from Western Europe. Napoleon was really stopped at Ukraine, and so was the Hitler's army stopped in Ukraine in 41, 42. So Ukraine works very well as a buffer for Russia. So if not a capture of Ukraine, Russia would certainly like Ukraine to be announced buffer and not a member of the NATO alliance, which brings NATO troops right on Russia's doorstep. Now, why NATO would look for a conflict is easy to understand because NATO forces and those people who manage the NATO establishment, which is more a political establishment and not just a military alliance, they always are looking for a purpose. With America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, they want a new purpose before the alliance is declared defunct. And therefore, they are going to be building up the threat of Russia and the fear of a Russian attack, which is something that the Western countries really continue to fear because not militarily itself, Russia also has the capacity to cripple Western Europe with the gas supplies that it sends to 40% of Western East Europe. If that stops, it will be a big blow to the lifestyle of the people there and the economies there. So Russia holds many cards. What the Americans and their Western friends can do is to cripple Russia's engagement with the Western world through the swift economic system of banking. But Russia has the friend China waiting in the wings to provide Russia the necessary economic heft if things go wrong. And Russia continues to provide China its massive glut for oil and energy, where Russia is the second largest producer outside OPEC. So it's really a strategic, geostrategic game that's being played out. What is very clear is that the world is now witnessing a new sort of battle lines drawn between East and West Europe. Call it a new Berlin Wall, call it a new Iron Wall, but there is a new divide and there's no going away with it. So this is clearly the defining moment of the Second Cold War.
Yes, absolutely, Maruf. You've sort of broken it down into the various layers and angles for us here to understand this entire issue at hand. We, of course, will wait and see now how it plays out at this point. Obviously, what Russia says can't be taken at face value at this point. But thank you so much for joining us with your perspective. Now, amid Russia's claims on Ukraine, discussions are on between Ministry of External Affairs and civil aviation authorities to increase the number of flights between India and Ukraine. According to sources, control rooms in the embassy as well as Ministry of External Affairs have been set up to respond to queries of Indian nationals in Ukraine and their families. MEA continues to monitor the developments amid the crisis. Meanwhile, the parliamentary panel has expressed concerns for Indians in Ukraine and asked the centre to prioritize their safe return.
Well, there are two things here that have to be talked about. The first, of course, is there is a crucial meeting, as you rightly said, with the External Affairs Ministry and the Civil Aviation Ministry. So in case people have to be moved out of Kiev and other parts of Ukraine, then very certainly there will be a plane perhaps being looked at. The second thing is a control room has been opened. And again, if it's necessary, all information can be routed through that control room. That's really the important thing. Anyone who has a relative or friend there in Kiev or other parts of Ukraine can call the control room and get all the information he or she needs.